They no longer have any military opposition, but they face what's possibly an even bigger challenge: actually running the country and creating a viable economy. According to the World Bank, 40% of Afghanistan's GDP was international aid, and once the Taliban seized power, much of that aid was frozen. The country is facing economic collapse. Banks have closed. People are running out of food. The Taliban is making overtures. The foreign minister recently hosted a meeting of ambassadors in Kabul. The UN Special Representative to Afghanistan, Canadian Deborah Lyons, was there. So what are the next steps? We get some insight from Omar Samad, Afghanistan's ambassador to Ottawa from 2004 to 2009. I know that you witnessed the decades of turbulence in Afghanistan, that you know, of course, the history of foreigners attempting to conquer the country. In that arc of history, where do you think Afghanistan is right now?
I hope Afghanistan finds its space, its place in the region, in the world. We all hoped for the past 20 years that it has, after the 9/11 intervention took place. And I, as an Afghan who went back to try to reshape and rebuild the new country, I was hoping that we would be back on our own feet, that we would own our own country, that we would rule according to the wishes of our people.
Is it possible that the Taliban of 2021 are different than the Taliban of the 1990s?
They are more sophisticated. In some ways, they can be more dangerous. But I also think they've learned some lessons. They're a bit more worldly. They have been exposed to the world much more than they used to. They have seen how, how governments function, how people live their lives in other countries, even especially Islamic societies. They are, in my opinion, being tested right now. The burden of proof is on the Taliban.
And so the question is, how does the rest of the world respond now, right? Do you think it is right and appropriate for countries to consider recognizing the Taliban as the government?
I think that in some ways it's simple. If they show that they're broad-based, meaning they're accepting of other political and social elements in society to be part of a new order, if they respect men and women's rights in Afghanistan and allow women and girls to have access to education and employment, if they allow a certain level of freedoms such as media freedom, which actually still exists, they haven't cracked down totally on that. People still get on TV and criticize them, which is amazing in some ways, but if they continue that, and if they crack down on international organizations or terrorist groups that are using Afghanistan or want to use Afghanistan, whether they're pro-Talib or anti-Talib, and crack down on those elements, whether they're anti-Western or whether they're anti-China or Iran or Russia, then I think that they will, there's very little room for the rest of the world not to recognize them. But those are some really big conditions that they have to meet.
Well, yes, those are a lot of conditions. Those are a lot of ifs. Do you see any signs of those kinds of advancements actually taking place?
Yes and no. So you see some girls going to school, others not. You see boys going to school, but then women teachers not going to work. Or women in general selectively go to work, but in general they don't. And I think the more presence you have in Afghanistan, if the international community is engaged, if the international media is still engaged, if there are some UN agencies functioning, we would have a window into Afghanistan and we would know what the Taliban are doing and whether they're changing or not. If you shut down and you close the country and you isolate the country and you cut its lifelines, then obviously not only are we jeopardizing the livelihoods and the lives of Afghans, but we are also in some ways closing the door and basically saying you can do whatever you want. And we're not watching and we're not listening, which is exactly what we did in the 1990s, which was, in my view, a very big mistake.
What role do you think countries like Canada should play now? What leverage does Canada have in changing the circumstances on the ground, improving the circumstances on the ground for people in Afghanistan?
Canada right now is playing a very important role by being a host country for thousands of Afghans who are leaving. That is the part of the generosity of Canadians. But Canada also has a lot to offer in terms of humanitarian assistance, because that is a vital need right now. We should not forget the 35 million Afghans for whom we went and we claim to have fought for and defended their rights. Canada also should play a role in making sure that the world is safe and that we all are collaborating in the fight against terrorism, and that make sure that the Taliban play their role. Canada eventually can play a major role in sectors such as mining and agriculture and industry in the future in Afghanistan. I really hope that one day we reach that point where we have Canadian investment and Canadian expertise in Afghanistan again.
You're not totally pessimistic, is what I'm hearing.
No, I'm not. I can't afford to be totally pessimistic.
Why is that? Why do you feel you can't afford to be pessimistic about the future?
Because that will take the country in a very bad and wrong direction.
Is that coming from your heart as an Afghan?
Well, partly from my heart, but also partly from a policy perspective, and partly as a diplomat. My job has been to identify and resolve issues and problems. My job is not to make it more difficult. So we have a problem. My job is to find solutions for it. And I know that, this it's too raw for now. It's really, everything is very raw for the moment. And everybody is either very upset and angry, or they are very disappointed and vindictive. And I think that we need to find a balance between what could be very detrimental to Afghanistan versus what can help us get out of this mess and back on track.